Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
In the beginning, there were only shadows beneath the feet of giants. They towered over the lands, their steps shaking the earth as they moved, indifferent to the small creatures that scurried in their wake. To them, humans were nothing more than pests, worthless, insignificant beings, barely worthy of notice. The giants had ruled for centuries, their reign unchallenged by those too weak to stand against them. They used humans as slaves, hunted them for sport, and crushed any rebellion with a swipe of their massive hands. Humanity had learned to live in the shadows, to hide, to survive, but not Eric. Even as a child, he had never accepted the way things were. He had watched his parents, his village, his people bend their knees to the giants, offering tribute in the form of crops, livestock, and sometimes even their own children. It was the price of survival, they said. But Eric had always believed there was another way. Now, as he stood atop the cliffs overlooking the canyon, watching the movements of the giant patrol below, he knew that the time had come to test that belief. The giants marched in formation, their heavy footfalls echoing through the narrow pass. There were 8 of them in total, each as tall as a tower, their broad shoulders draped in the skins of the creatures they had hunted. Their faces were expressionless, devoid of emotion, as they scanned the horizon for any sign of resistance. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had studied their movements for years, watching them from the safety of the cliffs, cataloging every detail. He knew their habits, their patterns, and most importantly, their weaknesses. "They're coming," whispered a voice at his side. Eric turned to see Talia, one of the warriors who had joined his cause. She was tall for a human, her body lean and muscular, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her hand rested on the hilt of her blade, but her knuckles were white with tension. "They always come," Eric replied, his voice calm. "And they always leave. Today will be different." Talia didn't respond, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't the only one. In the caves behind them, the rest of the group waited, 30 men and women, armed with spears, bows, and whatever crude weapons they could find. They were fighters, yes, but they were also afraid. And why wouldn't they be? They had lived their entire lives under the giants' rule, hiding in fear. What Eric was asking of them was nothing short of madness, but madness, Eric knew, was their only chance. "Are the traps set?" Eric asked, turning his gaze back to the canyon. Talia nodded. "Everything's ready. The seismic charges are in place, the rock slides are primed, and the flame traps are buried just beneath the surface." "Good," Eric said, his lips tightening into a grim smile. "Now all we need is patience." The giants moved closer, their footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. Eric could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the tremor of the earth as the behemoths approached. It was a familiar sensation, one he had grown accustomed to over the years. But today, for the first time, it filled him with anticipation rather than dread. He signaled to the others, and they fell into position along the cliffs, their eyes trained on the giants below. The plan was simple in its design but intricate in its execution. The giants were slow, predictable creatures, reliant on their size and strength. They had never faced an enemy who could outthink them, who could anticipate their every move. That was about to change. The lead giant entered the narrowest part of the canyon, its massive head scraping the walls on either side. It paused for a moment, sniffing the air as if sensing something was amiss. But before it could react, Eric gave the signal. A deafening crack split the air as the first of the seismic charges detonated. The ground beneath the giant's feet buckled, and the creature let out a roar of surprise as the earth gave way beneath it. It tumbled forward, its massive body slamming into the rocks below with a bone-shaking crash. The other giants hesitated, their tiny eyes scanning the canyon for the source of the attack. But it was too late. The second charge went off, triggering a rockslide that sent tons of stone cascading down the cliffs, smashing into the giants' ranks. The air was filled with the sound of crashing boulders, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of flames as the first of the fire traps ignited. Eric watched, his heart racing, as the giants were caught in the chaos. Some tried to climb the cliffs, their massive hands grasping at the rocks, but the humans were ready. Arrows rained down from above, striking the giants in their eyes, their throats, their vulnerable spots. The giants swatted at them, but their movements were slow, cumbersome. They were used to fighting enemies they could see, enemies they could crush beneath their feet. They had never faced an enemy like Eric. Keep them pinned. Eric shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Don't let them regroup. Talia and the others sprang into action, hurling spears and loosing arrows with deadly precision. The giants flailed, their massive arms swinging wildly as they tried to defend themselves. But Eric's traps were working perfectly, cutting off their escape routes, forcing them into vulnerable positions. It was working. For the first time in his life, Eric felt the sweet taste of victory. The giants were falling, one by one, their massive bodies crashing to the ground in a storm of dust and blood. The canyon was filled with the sounds of their defeat, their roars of pain, the cracking of bones, the hiss of flames, but it wasn't over yet. The dust began to settle, a low, rumbling growl filled the air. Eric's blood ran cold as he looked up, his eyes widening in horror. Garoth, the giant leader, emerged from the far side of the canyon, his massive form dwarfing the others. He was twice their size, his body covered in thick, scarred hide, his eyes burning with fury. In his hands, he carried a weapon, a massive stone club, carved with runes and stained with the blood of countless humans. Eric had known this moment would come. He had studied Garoth, just as he had studied the other giants. But knowing the enemy and facing them were two very different things. Garoth's eyes locked onto Eric, and the giant let out a roar that shook the canyon walls. With a single step, he crushed one of the fallen giants beneath his feet, his gaze never leaving Eric. Talia. Eric shouted, his voice hoarse. Get the others out of here. But, now. Eric's voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. He didn't wait to see if she would obey. His mind was already racing, searching for a way to stop Garoth. The traps had taken care of the other giants, but Garoth was different. He was smarter, faster, and far more dangerous. If Eric didn't stop him here, everything they had worked for would be lost. Garoth charged, his massive feet pounding the ground as he barreled toward Eric. The cliff walls shook with every step, and Eric could feel the vibrations through his boots. There was no time to think, only time to act. He sprinted to the edge of the cliff, diving into a narrow crevice just as Garoth's club came crashing down where he had stood moments before. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the rocks, but Eric didn't stop. He scrambled through the crevice, his mind working furiously. He had one last trap. The explosives buried beneath the canyon floor, hidden deep in the rock. It was their last line of defense, a final weapon designed to bring down the entire canyon if all else failed. But it wasn't meant for one giant. Eric glanced over his shoulder. Garoth was coming, his massive body crashing through the narrow passage, his eyes burning with fury. There was no time. Eric reached the detonator, his fingers shaking as he activated the device. The countdown began, and Eric sprinted toward the nearest tunnel, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear Garoth behind him, feel the giant's breath on his neck. Then, The world exploded. The world exploded behind Eric as he dived into the narrow tunnel, the force of the blast pushing him forward with an almost violent shove. Dust and debris rained down around him, choking the air as the canyon walls trembled under the impact. His ears rang from the explosion, but his mind stayed sharp, focused. The trap had been triggered, the final gamble made. The tunnel was just wide enough for him to crawl through, his hands scraping against the rough rock as he moved deeper into the safety of the underground passage. Behind him, he could still hear the rumble of the canyon collapsing, the cracks and groans of stone giving way as the explosives did their work. Garroth was somewhere in the middle of that destruction, but Eric didn't dare to believe it was over yet. Crawling on, he could see the faint light ahead, the exit of the tunnel where the others would be waiting. His muscles burned from the effort, but he pressed forward, each movement a battle against the fear that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He had faced impossible odds before, but Garroth was something else. He was more than just a giant, he was a living force of nature. Finally, Eric emerged from the tunnel, gasping for breath as the fresh air hit his lungs. The sight before him was chaos. Dust still hung thick in the air, mingling with the smoke from the fires that had erupted during the battle. The canyon was a shattered ruin, the result of his carefully laid traps. It looked like the earth had been torn apart, and in a way, it had. Talia was there, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes scanning the destruction. When she saw Eric, she rushed to his side, relief flooding her features. "You made it," she said, her voice breathless. We thought you didn't make it out." Eric nodded, still catching his breath. His hands shook as he wiped the dirt from his face. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice low. He didn't want to hope, not yet. Not until he was sure. Talia glanced back at the canyon. "The others are checking. We haven't seen any movement from the giants since the last explosion." Eric didn't answer right away. His mind was already calculating, thinking through every possibility. Garroth had been smart, smarter than the other giants. Eric had been prepared for that, but he hadn't expected just how formidable the giant would be in combat. The traps had worked on the others, but Garroth, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. As if on cue, a low, rumbling sound echoed from the depths of the canyon. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Eric's heart sank. "It wasn't over, no," he whispered. Talia's eyes widened as she followed his gaze back to the shattered remains of the canyon. And then, from the smoke and rubble, a massive figure began to rise. Garroth, the giant's body was bloodied and battered, his hide torn and scorched by the explosions, but he was still alive. His chest heaved with labored breaths, and in his hand, he still gripped the stone club, its runes glowing faintly in the smoke. Eric stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. How could he still be standing? Every trap, every explosive should have brought the entire canyon down on him. But there Garroth stood, defying everything Eric had planned. "Eric." Talia's voice broke through his thoughts. "We have to move. We can't fight him like this." Eric's jaw clenched. She was right, but if they ran now, Garroth would hunt them down. The giant was too close, too angry. They had one chance left, and it was a long shot. Eric could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on him. "Get the others out of here," Eric said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I'll draw him away." "What?" Talia grabbed his arm, her eyes flashing with anger. "You can't be serious. You won't survive out there alone." Eric met her gaze, his face hard. "It's the only way. He's after me. He knows I'm the one who set the traps. If I can keep him focused on me, you'll have a chance to regroup. Talia's grip tightened. I'm not leaving you. Talia, go. Eric's voice was firm, but not unkind. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. If we don't end this here, the giants will come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come. And next time, we won't have the advantage. Talia's eyes filled with frustration, but she knew he was right. Reluctantly, she released his arm, her expression one of grim determination. I'll be right behind you, she said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't true. Eric nodded, his lips twitching into a brief smile. Go. With that, Talia turned and sprinted toward the others, calling out orders to retreat. Eric watched her go for a moment before turning back to face Garroth. The giant was lumbering toward him, his movements slower now, more deliberate. Blood dripped from his wounds, leaving a trail on the ground, but his eyes burned with rage and determination. Eric knew he couldn't win in a direct fight. Garroth was too strong, too big. But if there was one thing Eric had learned from years of studying the giants, it was that their size made them overconfident. They relied on brute strength, never expecting their enemies to outthink them. He backed away slowly, leading Garroth toward the edge of the canyon. His mind raced, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. The ground here was unstable from the explosions, the rock brittle and cracked. One wrong step, and Garroth could fall. But it would take more than luck. He needed precision. As Garroth closed the distance, Eric made his move. He sprinted toward a narrow ledge that jutted out over the canyon. It was a risk. If the rock gave way too soon, he'd fall to his death. But if he could time it just right, Garroth roared as he charged after him, his massive feet shaking the ground with every step. Eric could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, could hear the rocks shifting beneath him. The ledge creaked under his weight, but he kept moving, pushing himself to the very edge. At the last possible moment, Eric leaped, throwing himself across the gap to the other side of the canyon. Behind him, the ledge crumbled, the rocks giving way with a deafening crack. Garroth's momentum carried him forward, and for a moment, the giant teetered on the edge, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance, but it was too late. With a final roar of fury, Garroth tumbled forward, his massive body crashing into the depths of the canyon below. The sound of his fall echoed through the mountains, followed by the sickening thud of his impact far below. Eric lay on the ground, gasping for breath. His entire body ached, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't move. Not yet. He needed to be sure. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. No movement, no sound. Just the wind, gently blowing through the canyon. Finally, Eric pulled himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He staggered to the edge and looked down. Garroth lay at the bottom of the canyon, unmoving, his body half buried in the rubble. He was dead. It was over, the giants were defeated. Eric stood there for a long time, staring down at the fallen giant. The weight of what they had accomplished began to settle in. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all of humanity. For the first time in centuries, they were free. Talia and the others approached, their faces grim but hopeful. They had seen the fall, heard the crash. There was no need for words. The war was over. Eric turned to face them, his expression weary but determined. "We did it," he said quietly. "The giants are gone." They didn't cheer, didn't celebrate. Not yet. There was too much to do. The world was broken, and they would have to rebuild it from the ground up. But for the first time in their lives, they had the chance to do just that. And that was enough. Eric took a deep breath and looked out over the canyon, the ruined battlefield that had once been their prison. Now, it was a symbol of their freedom. The fight was over. But the future was just beginning.